France, June 1944. The fields around Saint-Lô were quiet for the first time in days. The gunfire had drifted east, leaving behind a wasteland of mud, shattered helmets, and the low moans of the wounded. Medics moved between makeshift tents, their hands slick with blood and rain, their bandages running out. Every man they loaded onto a jeep was a gamble. Could he survive the ride before infection or shock claimed him? Then, through the mist, came the rumble of something strange. A line of boxy white trucks, their sides marked not with artillery symbols, but with red crosses and a faint hum. When the doors opened, the air inside was cold. For the first time, medics had more than bandages and morphine. They had light. They had sterile tools. They had controlled temperature. A miracle in the mud. Inside these converted refrigeration trucks, wounded men who once would have died within hours found a fighting chance. What began as a wartime improvisation soon became a revolution in battlefield medicine. An invention born from America's obsession with logistics, speed, and saving lives. In the early years of the Second World War, a wounded soldier's survival often depended less on the severity of his injuries and more on how quickly he could be moved. On the Western Front, even minor wounds could turn fatal within hours. Heat, dust, and infection turned open cuts into death sentences. The Army Medical Department faced a grim arithmetic. For every man killed outright, 2 or 3 more died before reaching a hospital tent. By 1942, American planners understood that firepower alone would not win the war. Logistics would. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, already responsible for feeding millions, now faced another mission: keeping the wounded alive long enough to receive proper care. The answer, strangely enough, lay in the same technology that kept milk cold in Midwestern grocery stores. Before the war, companies such as Frigidaire, General Motors, and Kelvinator had perfected the art of mechanical refrigeration. America's domestic market was overflowing with innovation: insulated panels, portable compressors, and reliable temperature regulators. When war erupted, these same firms shifted their assembly lines from home refrigerators to cold storage trailers and cargo trucks, designed to keep meat, plasma, and medicine viable as they crossed oceans and deserts. What no one foresaw was how this cold chain, the invisible network of temperature-controlled logistics, would transform from a supply necessity into a life-saving weapon. In North Africa, 1943, the U.S. Army's refrigerated trucks delivered blood plasma that could last weeks instead of hours. For the first time, medics could treat severe shock at the front rather than waiting for evacuation. The trucks became mobile lifelines, humming quietly beside tank convoys and field kitchens. Yet a question lingered. Could these cold compartments do more than preserve supplies? Could they become self-contained treatment centers, moving wherever the wounded fell? That idea would soon find its proving ground in Europe, where invasion plans demanded miracles in medicine as well as in arms. By late 1943, the United States had mastered the art of movement. Every weapon, ration, and bullet had its place in the supply chain. A mechanical heartbeat that pulsed from Detroit to the beaches of Europe. But when it came to the wounded, that precision faltered. Evacuation routes were long, improvised, and fragile. Surgeons operated under canvas roofs lit by lanterns, while men bled out in trucks designed for cargo. Not care. It was Colonel Albert J. Glass, a visionary in the Army Medical Department, who first proposed repurposing the military's growing fleet of refrigerated cargo trucks. His concept was deceptively simple. If a machine could maintain steady temperature and airflow for meat or blood plasma, it could just as easily sustain a wounded man's chance at life. He brought together 2 unlikely groups: mechanical engineers from the Quartermaster Corps and combat surgeons from the front lines. Their task, to design a truck that could move anywhere, withstand shell fire, and serve as a miniature hospital in motion. Within weeks, prototypes began to appear at depots in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The modifications were ingenious. Insulated aluminum walls became sterile panels that resisted bacteria. Floor drains were installed for washing down after operations. Compressor systems once used for frozen beef were recalibrated to hold a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the ideal climate for medical instruments, oxygen tanks, and blood plasma. Even the truck's engines were modified so the refrigeration units could run independently, ensuring uninterrupted power during surgery. Inside, folding surgical tables were bolted to the walls. Cabinets stored morphine, sulfa powder, and transfusion equipment. Small portholes allowed light in without compromising sterility. What had once been a delivery truck for butter and meat was now an operating theater on wheels. In early 1944, field tests began across southern England as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy. Medical officers were astonished. In these trucks, they could perform amputations, stabilize head wounds, and transfuse blood without waiting for evacuation aircraft. The mortality rate for severely wounded soldiers dropped dramatically, sometimes by half, when treated in transit. For the first time, war's most brutal reality met American practicality. Logistics had become compassion, and steel walls once meant for cold storage were now keeping hearts beating. These rolling hospitals were ready just in time, for the greatest invasion in history was only months away. In the early hours of June 7, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were still smoldering. Allied troops had clawed their way inland, and behind them came the quiet heroes of the invasion, the medics. They moved through shattered hedgerows, searching for survivors among the wreckage of landing craft and burnt-out tanks. For most, it was the same desperate rhythm as every campaign before: triage, bandage, pray. But this time, something new was waiting just beyond the dunes. A convoy of white trucks humming softly under overcast skies. The familiar red crosses painted on their sides hinted at mercy, but few realized what was inside. When Corporal James R. Caldwell, a combat medic with the 4th Infantry Division, first stepped into one of the vehicles, he froze. The air was cool, almost crisp. It felt like stepping into a hospital back home, he later wrote. We were still in France, still in hell, but inside that truck, it felt like order again. Inside these mobile wards, the chaos of the battlefield transformed into measured calm. Lights hung from the ceiling. Stainless steel trays held instruments that no longer rusted or boiled over in field tents. The cool air slowed bleeding, reduced infection, and steadied the surgeon's hands. Across the channel, American engineers listened to field reports with quiet satisfaction. Many had never seen combat. Their war was fought with pencils, blueprints, and slide rules. Yet their invention was saving lives faster than any new weapon. One engineer at Frigidaire later said, "We didn't build trucks. We built time, and time is what saves a man." Even British officers, initially skeptical of the Americans' obsession with mechanical solutions, began to adopt the design. The Royal Army Medical Corps requested several modified units for operations in Normandy and Belgium. The term cold treatment soon entered the Allied medical lexicon, a method that slowed the body's metabolic shock and extended survival chances by precious minutes. To German prisoners, the sight of these trucks was bewildering. Many believed they were carrying food or ammunition. When captured medics explained their purpose, one Wehrmacht doctor remarked bitterly, "You Americans even mechanized mercy." What began as an experiment had become a phenomenon, a quiet revolution moving steadily with every convoy deeper into occupied Europe. Behind every truck that rolled across France was a supply network unlike anything the world had seen. Each mobile hospital was not just a medical asset. It was a node in an immense system of temperature-controlled logistics. driven by American industry and discipline. The Quartermaster Corps issued maintenance schedules as detailed as those for tanks. Compressors were checked hourly, refrigeration lines cleaned daily, generators tuned weekly. Spare parts traveled in parallel convoys, ensuring no truck stayed idle longer than a single day. It was the same philosophy that built Liberty ships and Red Ball Express convoys: speed, consistency, and redundancy. But here, it wasn't bullets being delivered. It was life itself. From a technological standpoint, the trucks represented the birth of field climate control. The Army engineers understood what hospitals would only later confirm. A steady temperature and clean airflow could prevent bacterial growth better than most antiseptics. The insulation panels were lined with silver-backed fiber, reflecting heat while reducing condensation. Some models even carried primitive thermostats, simple mercury switches that kept the cabin within 5 degrees of the target range. Yet it wasn't only about science. There was something moral embedded in the machinery. In a war defined by destruction, the United States was building devices designed purely to preserve. It reflected an American belief that progress, even in war, should serve human dignity. Field chaplains often commented on how the trucks changed morale. Soldiers said it was easier to fight, knowing that, if they fell, someone had prepared a place for them beyond the chaos. It felt, one infantryman recalled, like someone back home had thought of us. Doctors noticed another change. Discipline and cooperation between medics and engineers deepened. Where once they had worked separately, one healing bodies, the other maintaining engines, now their missions overlapped. A mechanic's clean compressor could mean the difference between fever and recovery. A doctor's precision could justify every rivet that Detroit had forged. Even the enemy took note. German intelligence files captured in late 1944 described American surgical vehicles with controlled interior climate. The report concluded grimly: their wounded return to battle faster than ours. Their machines bleed for them. In the end, the refrigerated truck became more than an invention. It was an idea, proof that compassion could be engineered, and that in the calculus of total war, mercy could travel on 4 wheels. Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The snow fell in silence, muffling the roar of artillery somewhere beyond the ridgeline. The temperature dropped below zero, fuel lines froze, and even rifles jammed in the cold. For the medics, it was worse than the bullets. Wounds that might have healed in summer now turned black overnight. Morphine froze solid inside its ampules. Blood plasma, once the savior of the front, crystallized into useless glassy clumps. In the middle of this frozen nightmare, a column of trucks crawled through the woods, white against white, red crosses glinting in the headlights. These were the same refrigeration units that had cooled supplies in Normandy, now repurposed again. Heaters reversed, insulation reinforced, compressors rewired to push warm air instead of cold. They were no longer refrigerators. They were lifeboats. Lieutenant Dr. Howard Mills, commanding a field surgical team, described the moment they opened the first truck near Bastogne. We stepped into light and warmth. It was 20 below outside, but inside those walls you could feel life again. We had no hospital left standing, but the trucks became one. Inside the converted vehicles, men who had been pulled from snowdrifts were stripped of frozen clothing and laid under electric blankets powered by the same generators once meant for cooling compressors. Plasma thawed in water baths, tourniquets loosened. For the first time in that campaign, soldiers stopped dying faster than they could be saved. Mechanics ran cables from Sherman tanks to feed the generators. Medics pumped oxygen with one hand and rewired heaters with the other. When fuel was scarce, crews burned anything, spare rations, wooden crates, to keep the engines running. The truck's aluminum shells steamed against the snow, glowing like beacons in a white abyss. German shell fire occasionally found them, but even shrapnel couldn't halt the rhythm of the work inside. The thick insulation muffled explosions, allowing surgeons to continue stitching arteries as if in another world. The trucks earned a nickname whispered across the lines: the warm rooms. In the official reports that followed, officers noted that mortality among the severely wounded dropped by nearly 40% during the Ardennes campaign wherever these mobile hospitals operated. What began as refrigeration technology had now become the most reliable shelter in the European winter. And still, greater tests lay ahead. Crossing the Rhine, caring for prisoners, sustaining entire field divisions as Germany collapsed. March 1945, Western Germany. The Rhine had been crossed, bridges burned behind the retreating Wehrmacht, and American divisions surged eastward in unstoppable rhythm. Behind every armored column came the supply convoys, and with them, the white-painted refrigeration trucks that had become the beating heart of frontline medicine. For the medics and engineers of the Third Army, the final push felt like a race between death and deliverance. Cities were falling faster than hospitals could be built, and the wounded flooded every road. In bombed-out villages, the trucks lined up side by side, transforming courtyards into improvised medical wards. The same engines that had once preserved frozen meat were now preserving human life in shattered towns from Cologne to Kassel. Captain Eleanor Hayes, one of the few female army surgeons deployed to the continent, recalled that each morning the trucks were the first sound of mercy. "You'd hear the generators hum before the artillery," she said. "That low, steady vibration meant we could work again. It meant the wounded still had time." In the shadow of collapsing German defenses, the system reached its peak. Refrigeration units were modified to serve dual functions: cool compartments for blood storage in one section, heated surgical space in another. Nurses sterilized tools in metal trays over diesel burners, while compressors rumbled in the background. The trucks became modular hospitals, linking together by cables and hoses, creating small complexes capable of handling dozens of patients at once. General George S. Patton, notorious for his impatience with anything that slowed the advance, reportedly stopped at one such convoy near Frankfurt. After seeing a field operation in progress, he simply muttered, "Keep them rolling," and ordered priority fuel allocation for all medical transport units. For German civilians watching from the ruins, the sight was bewildering. Many had expected vengeance, not compassion. Instead, they saw American soldiers setting up mobile wards that treated friend and foe alike. "We could not understand," wrote one local nurse later, "how the same trucks that brought war also brought medicine." In the weeks that followed, the mobile hospitals became lifelines for newly liberated prisoners and displaced refugees. Frost-bitten evacuees from concentration camps were placed inside the same vehicles that had once cooled rations for GIs. The symbolism was powerful. The machinery of war turned into an instrument of mercy. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, hundreds of these mobile units had saved tens of thousands of lives. The quiet hum of their generators became the soundtrack of survival, echoing long after the guns fell silent. When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. Roads lay broken, hospitals gutted, and epidemics threatened the displaced millions drifting between shattered borders. Amid that devastation, the same white trucks that had followed the armies across France and Germany remained in motion, now under a different flag, a different mission. The U.S. Army Medical Department kept them running through the occupation. Their generators powered lamps in makeshift clinics. Their compressors cooled vaccines instead of blood. In one report from the U.S. 7th Army, engineers noted that the mobile surgical trucks have become hospitals for civilians as well as soldiers. What began as an experiment in field surgery had become the foundation of post-war medical outreach. American doctors returning home brought more than memories. They brought an idea that medicine could travel. By 1946, veterans of the Quartermaster Corps were consulting with civilian agencies on designs for ambulances with temperature-controlled compartments. Within a decade, refrigerated transport would carry not just food, but penicillin, plasma, and organs. Every modern blood bank truck, every disaster response vehicle humming quietly on a city street, traces its lineage to those improvised hospital convoys that crossed the Rhine. Industry took notice, too. Frigidaire, General Motors, and Westinghouse began marketing medical-grade refrigeration units using technology proven on the battlefield. In Detroit's trade fairs, posters showed a white truck under a red cross with the slogan, "Built for War," serving life. Few civilians realized how literal that claim was. For the soldiers and medics who had worked inside those metal walls, the legacy was deeply personal. Many had spent nights in those trucks listening to the steady hum that meant another man would live till morning. Years later, they still described the sound as something sacred, the voice of survival. The same mechanical pulse now beat inside hospitals around the world. The war had ended, but the idea endured that logistics, when guided by compassion, could become the purest form of mercy. In the years following victory, America's war machines became tools of healing. Across occupied Germany, Japan, and the Philippines, thousands of surplus vehicles were stripped of armor and refitted for peace. Among them, the refrigeration trucks stood out. Too practical, too valuable, too humane to discard. Under the Marshall Plan, hundreds of these units were donated to European relief organizations. The World Health Organization, newly founded in 1948, adopted similar mobile systems for vaccine delivery in devastated regions. Where once they had carried blood to the front, now they carried penicillin to refugee camps and cholera vaccines to bombed-out villages. The Cold War soon turned the lessons of logistics into instruments of diplomacy. American aid convoys, often painted in the same white and red scheme, rolled through Asia, Africa, and Latin America, delivering not soldiers, but medicine. Behind each engine hum lay the same principle born on the battlefields of France. That mobility could mean mercy. At home, hospitals adopted mobile units for emergency care, rural outreach, and disaster response. In 1953, the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command formally credited the wartime refrigeration truck program with inspiring the first designs for mobile Army surgical hospitals, the MASH units that would become famous in Korea and beyond. What began as an improvisation had evolved into doctrine. The idea that technology should serve humanity became a quiet undercurrent of post-war American identity. Industrial giants that had once built tanks and bombers rebranded themselves as engineers of comfort, health, and modern living. Frigidaire's post-war ads showed smiling nurses loading vaccines into refrigerators, while Kelvinator promoted its wartime heritage as proof of endurance and care. But for those who had seen the original trucks in action, the legacy wasn't commercial, it was moral. A mechanic named Frank Delaney, who had maintained the units across Belgium, later said, "We built something that never fired a shot, but it still won battles." The quiet hum of refrigeration compressors, once drowned by the thunder of war, now symbolized something deeper: the transformation of destruction into preservation, and of invention into compassion. By the early 1960s, the concept had spread far beyond military medicine. Refrigerated mobile clinics served remote villages in Africa, polio vaccination teams in India, and flood relief operations in the United States. Few remembered their origin, those improvised American trucks parked in the mud of Normandy. Yet their descendants were saving lives across half the world. War had demanded ingenuity. Peace had inherited its mercy. In every war, there are machines built to destroy and machines built to endure. Most are forgotten, left to rust in fields or vanish into museums. Yet some quietly outlive the noise. not because they were powerful, but because they were merciful. The refrigerated trucks of World War II began as a logistical curiosity, just another entry in an endless inventory of engines, gears, and steel. But on the battlefields of Europe, they became something sacred. Proof that in a world unraveling, humanity could still be engineered. Their legacy is not measured in miles driven or tons delivered, but in heartbeats saved, in every soldier who lived to see another dawn, in every refugee who found warmth when there was none. Each hum of those compressors was a promise that civilization, even surrounded by chaos, had not forgotten compassion. From Normandy's mud to the hospitals of modern cities, the idea endures that progress is not only the measure of how fast we fight, but of how fiercely we care. The same hands that built the weapons of war also built the machines of mercy. And somewhere, far away from the sound of battle, that hum still lingers, steady, patient, and alive.